Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 34th year and coming to the end of it, by the way, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. We also have on other brands of artists occasionally. We have had on sculptors, painters, musicians. If you have an idea for a guest who might be good for the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd love to get your suggestions about writers and other varieties of artists. I also want to remind you that the 1623 Studios, where we are produced, is a cable access television station. You don't get this service by going to Dish. It's a wonderful community service, so stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. Tonight we do have a writer who's been on before. He's a return writer by the name of Wayne Soini. He's written on many topics, written both fiction and real history. You may remember him from an earlier show talking about his novel Ed and Joe, about Edward Hopper and his wife Josephine. Tonight we're going to talk about his latest book, Abraham Lincoln, American Prince, Ancestry, Ambition, and the Anti-Slavery Cause. Welcome back to the Writer's Block, Wayne.
Very kind of you to invite me. I thank you very much.
I said before the show that some of our audience don't watch every show. I can't imagine, but they don't. So I wanted to ask you a couple repetitious questions. Where were you born and raised?
Gloucester, Massachusetts, and all the way through Gloucester High School, which gave me a real good foundation for furthering my education in all ways.
And where did you go to school after?
Well, University of Massachusetts in Amherst, followed by Suffolk Law School in Boston, and we have. I did go back to UMass Boston for a purpose of a master's degree in history. So
we had recently another Suffolk graduate by the name of Bill Scannell.
Sure.
Bill Scannell.
Bill Scannell, and a great lawyer in his own right, the hardest of all, criminal defense work. Yes.
So you, like Lincoln, were a lawyer, and you chose him to write about history, a historical, unique book, I want to say, because historians have not dealt with his family, and you deal with his family, more specifically his grandparents and his mother, Nancy. Can you tell us how, being a Massachusetts boy, you decided to write on this Kentucky-born, Illinois-raised president of ours?
And we're talking to a gentleman who was born in Illinois, so I respect that question. It isn't natural and normal to think about Lincoln too much in Massachusetts as it would be in Illinois. But I had the good luck of getting to a seminar taught by a nationwide respected Lincoln scholar named Charles B. Strozier. And Professor Strozier, who wrote the first psychobiography of Abraham Lincoln, a biography that was a bestseller in the 1980s.
And you mentioned him.
And I mentioned him rightly in my book. And I went to that seminar with interest in writing a historical narrative of some kind. He was writing one already. And when I emailed him after the seminar, he kindly allowed me to take part in it in a way that was both as a researcher and as a kind of a feedback person for him as he wrote his book. So much so that the book, as it came out, about Abraham Lincoln and his best friend, Joshua Speed, a dual biography. When the book came out, he actually had his name in it. It says, with Wayne Soini. So, I mean, I'm quite pleased and proud with that. I invited the collaboration to continue when I had an idea for this that you described, Abraham Lincoln and his family background. And Charles B. Strozier, being busy with lots of things and feeling, complimented me and said that I could do it. Why don't I just go forward and research and write it myself, which I did. So that's how this book came about, kind of on the ricochet from Charles B. Strozier to my standing on his foundation.
One of the reasons I was drawn to it is you're absolutely correct. You're from Illinois. You grew up with Lincoln.
Yes.
I wasn't born there, by the way. I was born in San Diego, but I don't remember San Diego.
You remember Illinois?
I remember Illinois, where I lived until I moved to Gloucester about 50 years ago. But I was drawn to that because of the Illinois background, and I was very interested in how you were tuned into Lincoln, and that's a good background, that seminar. When did you start it, and when did you have a copy in your hand?
Oh yeah, how many years? I think it was about 5 years from the start to the finish. As you call it, a copy in my hand from the McFarland publishers. You don't work 40 hours a week on the thing, but you think a lot about it, and then you occasionally take to the computer and type things up, and gradually you get there. It accumulates over time, and then you rewrite it all together. And then you rewrite it all together. There's nothing like rewriting what you started with. Yeah. I finally did have good luck in a gentleman from Virginia who, this is another state to talk about, but let me just get into it later, who helped with the photographs. I think it's illustrated by about a dozen photographs from Virginia, and captions that are very informative, largely from this fellow in Virginia who helped me, a stranger to me, but he came forward as a historically interested person.
And part of your research is chasing down permissions for these photographs.
Well, he was grand in that way. Many of the photographs were his own, and when they weren't, it was the Historical Association that he was a part of, so he was able to get me these permissions.
I want to ask you about the thesis and the core of the book, and ask you, as part of beginning that topic, if you could read part of the footnote number 5 for chapter 1, which really struck me as a good introduction to the book. I mean, you have a wonderful introduction, but this seemed to me one sentence I might ask you to use for the beginning of the show.
I'm delated. I'd like to.
I've got it faintly underlined in
do
that.
Okay. By the way, if I can prelude this thing with a mention, mainstream Lincoln scholars, and this would be probably 9 out of 10 out there, would say that Abraham Lincoln didn't care at all about his family background or who his grandfather was. But I am in the minority, along with Charles B. Strozier, who think that Abraham Lincoln secretly, and this is the odd part, secretly, had a great influence. He almost stood like an island, alone with himself, his mother, who died when he was 10, and her father, whom he never met. But let's do it. My goal is a modest one, to demonstrate and to follow, as closely as the record permits, the links between Lincoln and certain flesh of his flesh and blood of his blood, which actually is a quote from a speech Lincoln made, indicating the importance of the flesh of his flesh and the blood of his blood, namely his mother and her father, whom Lincoln once personally characterized as keys to who he was and all that he ever hoped to be.
I think the point that you make, that this is about, and very few books have been about, is personal background, and it makes it almost unique. And I think the way you treat the importance of women in here, Nancy Hanks, his mother, of course, but also Lucy, her mother,
yeah.
His grandmother, his maternal grandmother, and other women in his life. Tell me how the production went before I get into my questions. I got some points I want to ask you about.
In what way?
In
what way?
Okay. why Lincoln had
Emily's going to have to clean up our coughing. But anyway, go right ahead, please.
Why did Lincoln think that he had a terrible secret that he couldn't share? And he shared it only with his partner, at one time partner, Herndon, and also an unidentified special correspondent after he was in Washington.
It is the weirdest thing, because as soon as I tell any of the viewers and you'll scratch your head. Why? In other words, I'll say it. My mother was a great influence upon me. I wouldn't be what I am today without my mother. I owe everything to my mother. Now, why would that ever be a secret? He made his law partner, Billy Herndon, that you're talking about, promise that he would not reveal this, what he was going to say, would not reveal it in Lincoln's lifetime. And the secret was, my mother was a great influence upon me.
Well, there was a family secret behind that,
too. There it is, too. And it is because his mother inherited something wonderful, a great mind. His mother was known as an intellectual. People that knew his mother and gave statements about her to biographers said that Mrs. Lincoln, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was an intellectual. The term recurs and recurs. This wasn't a woman who milked the cows and made the...
This is a period when it's very hard to get an education out in the wilds of Kentucky and Illinois.
And she may not have gotten an education, but she was self-educated.
Yeah.
She kept her eyes open. She became a person who followed politics. Women had no right to vote, but she had an opinion on politics. She had read books about the rights of mankind. She knew the Declaration of Independence. She had studied General George Washington's exploits in the Revolution. She was able to give her children, including Abraham Lincoln, from his youth, information, knowledge about those days when the country was founded. And she always added it. She always inserted. She always injected into what she was talking with about history, that there was this unfulfilled promise of America, that all men are created equal. She was an anti-slavery philosopher, if you will, in the household. And Lincoln's exposure to, influences, he didn't go to school like you and I. He was stuck in the cabin. He did the chores on the farm, and it was an isolated place, and he didn't even get that much information from neighbors, distant neighbors, who might not know more than he did. But his intellectual mother brought things to him that enabled him to see and know about George Washington and the days that the country was founded, and anti-slavery, of course. He himself is quoted as he didn't remember a time. He couldn't remember far enough back that he wasn't opposed to slavery. So he must have been 6 or 7 years old when he came up and thought about, I'm against slavery, and never varied from that, from his youth to his age.
It's remarkable because she died when he was still very young, 10 years old, and yet he says over and over again in different places, she's the most important influence on my life, and I owe everything to her.
Yes. And as you mentioned, largely because behind door number 2 is this mysterious figure described in, Billy Herndon described it, the man as a rich Virginia planter. A Virginia planter, well, wealth in those days meant slaves. So this Virginia planter, who had a plantation in Virginia and was prominent in the community and was rich, was the, what would you call it, the driving force in Lincoln's hidden secret in his heart to go forward and to feel encouraged, to boost himself into educating himself as much as he could.
Lincoln was for his time, a century or more ahead. Maybe 2 centuries. He could intellectually fit in pretty comfortably today with a lot of our politicians and philosophers. So he was unashamed and he was unmoved by the fact that he had ancestors who owned slaves. He was unashamed of the fact that his mother's parents weren't married when she was born. And that was something that was not talked about in the 19th century. We're not completely over that now. But he didn't accept the morals and the mores of that time, which looks like a dark age to us. He was very, very advanced in his thinking and sympathies.
Well, it's the most astounding, I think it's the most astounding story in American history, if you look at it right. If you're a boy born in the woods and brought up to be a farmer until you're 22 years old, and your goal mentally is to eradicate slavery, you're taking on an institution that is older than the United States itself.
Yes.
Has preceded the formation of a government. It's hundreds of years old and embedded in the South. And the wealth of the country.
And he was born in Kentucky.
And he was born in a slave area, slave state. Take it that way.
And I got to say, southern Indiana and southern Illinois are about as southern as you can get, too.
In terms of sympathy or influences. Yes, they were pro-slavery people. So where in the heck would he have the gall to make it his life work to eliminate slavery of all institutions you could possibly take on? It's like Don Quixote. What would? And I say, what drove him is essentially a form of Thomas Jefferson, in his own family. He believed that his ancestor, his own grandfather, had been a slave owner who had fought in the American Revolution. There's reasons in my book, evidence that I describe why he believed his grandfather had taken part in the battles of the American Revolution, and he had his mother's word. This is the last thing I'll say on it. He had his mother's word on it that his blood was as good as George Washington's. His blood was as good as George Washington. Now, if you read it all, and you're a historian too, in the Virginia settlement, there was a group of families, first families of Virginia, and they interlocked. So the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Lees, and others were in this group of good blood in being able to lead the country and be ambitious. Lincoln believed that that blood flowed in his veins.
And I think at one point in your book, you talk about his grandfather's family. At that level was second family Virginia. Maybe
oddly enough,
just a real thin layer underneath the Lees and the Jeffersons and that class of people.
And I've got to say, he, we all know honest Abraham Lincoln, honest Abe. We know him as a person who was completely dedicated to speaking truthfully. And there was this is the one time I got to say he didn't meet the occasion with truth, and he could have. It's the same thing I say over and over. It's odd that he doesn't say, publicly, I owe everything to my mother and my grandfather, the Virginia planter. He doesn't say it. In fact, he covers up his background. This is a book anybody can get. It says The Life of Abraham Lincoln. It's a newspaper. The front of it, as you can tell, looks like a newspaper. And The Life of Abraham Lincoln originally was run as a series of newspaper articles in Republican newspapers in 1860 during the campaign for president.
I was going to say the Republican Party was not the same Republican Party as we have today, although it had just been founded.
It had just been founded, and Lincoln was really the first Republican nominee who became president. Lincoln, when it came to it, decided to camouflage or cover up his first family roots, and he declared in his outline for the he wrote a little outline that his biographer used, and the outline said that his families were on his father's side, his mother's side as well, were second families of Virginia, which is what you say. People who didn't own slaves, didn't have much, and were kind of the day laborers of their time, with no education or influence at all. He didn't want to admit that he had this burning ambition inside and belief in himself and self-confidence because of his prominent grandfather.
Go ahead. I'm looking for a picture that is in here. It's one of the best pictures in here. Of course, when I want to find it, I won't find it. But I think it's under that.
The one of the fellow on the horse riding around and...
No, it's just a close-up of him. No, I should have... Well, I'm not going to waste time. I want to talk to my guest.
All right, that's fine.
The pictures in here are really, really wonderful. I have another, if I could, talk about Nancy, Lincoln's mother. One of your chapters, chapter 8, is Lincoln's mother, Lincoln's hero. Now, you've touched on that.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
How
how strong a force was that? Was that something he said for public relations purposes, or was it deeply felt truth?
This is a wonderful question, and I think no matter how well or poorly I executed it, a necessary chapter for any historian excuse me, or biographer of Lincoln to get into, which is who was his hero? Who actually were his heroes? Remember, he was in the Civil War, and he was presented with evidences of heroism on the battlefield and combat. But if you look at the record of the Civil War, and I did, on his documents and letters and public speeches in 1861 to 1865, he uses heroism or heroics or hero very sparingly. That word is very rare in his correspondence or his speeches. And it really applies, the details in the book I won't get into, it really applies to quiet heroism, not bloodshed on the battlefield, but the sacrifices that people make in terms of, stresses, lost sleep, poverty, any sacrifices that people make on the home front or in battle in their ways, quiet heroism. So when he called his mother a hero, and he did, I apply that standard backwards and say he's talking about his mother enduring stoically and cheerfully, if you will, positively, making a life despite, having to overcome obstacles. And the obstacles Nancy Hanks faced was she was born without a father. She was the single parent routine, rare in those days. And her father was missing in action. It was a prominent man, a rich man, a person who could have given her an education and a different life, different start, but never did. So she was abandoned by this Virginia planter and had every reason to resent or write him out of her life story.
Yeah.
She didn't do that. Even to her children, she was talking about they had blood as good as George Washington. She was elevating, to a high degree, her own image of what a human being should be.
This is Lucy. You're talking
No, in this instance, it's, of course, Nancy, Lincoln's mother. Let's use Lucy. Lincoln's mother was born of Lucy Hanks, for sure, and an unnamed Virginia planter, outside of marriage. Lucy was known to be promiscuous.
This was Lucy. I want to make
Lucy.
this clear there. Lucy is Lincoln's maternal grandfather.
Grandmother.
Grandmother.
Yes, of course.
Grandmother.
And she was a uneducated, sort of maverick, unsocial person who wouldn't have been termed a hero by Lincoln.
Yeah.
But his mother and her father, the Virginia planter, were rich, prominent people who sacrificed for the American Revolution, and he respected them outside of everybody in the family, outside of his father or his mother's other relatives.
Yeah.
So it came down to having an influence second to none. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln's hero for her overcoming all obstacles to become an intellectual who could speak. And there's no doubt about it, she could talk articulately about the issues of the day. There's an important affidavit or evidence that I put in the book where it was overheard. She was overheard talking in her teen years. She was 17, 18 years old, talking about the election between Jefferson and Adams and, the issues that were involved.
I wish we had more people like that around today.
Who can do it, yeah.
I'm loving this conversation. I just noticed we're almost out of time. I'm loving this conversation. I wish we could go longer. I want to thank you very much, Wayne Soini, for bringing this book to the public. It's unique, and it's really, I want to recommend it to our audience. Really good, solid read. Well documented and unique because it talks about women in his life as being, especially his mother Nancy, being a tremendous influence, and that hasn't been talked about. Almost all the books I've read about Lincoln, I haven't read 1% of them, but they're about Lincoln during the war.
Sure.
And that's the big focus. So I want to thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank all of the mothers who are great influences on their children, both in Gloucester and outside. Thanks very much.
I want to thank our TV audience as well for being with us. If you've learned something about the women influencing, especially his mother, Nancy Hanks, influencing our great President Abraham Lincoln, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thank you for being with us. Now, I hope to see you again next time on the Writer's Block. Good night.